Welcome, everyone, to this week's Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And this webinar, we're going to be talking about data types. So let's get cracking. We got a lot to cover. So what is a data type, first of all? Starting right at the beginning. Step one. A data type allows you to specify the values that can be contained in the actual type. It tells you the operations that you can do on the particular thing that you've specified. Math operations that are supported, pretty much anything. It tells you the meaning of the data, whether it's an actual number, whether it's something else. And it determines how the data is actually stored. A lot of this is abstracted from you, but there is storage requirements behind the scenes, and sometimes it is helpful to know how that storage is being managed. Now, the important thing to understand in the case of Xojo is that Xojo is strongly typed. So this means that everything has to have a type. You can't just create a variable and not specify a type. You have to specify a type. Now, before we get too far along, I want to bring up the concept of what we call our intrinsic types versus pretty much everything else, which are class types. Now, the intrinsic types are the types that are built into Xojo. These are native types. They behave a little bit differently than classes. You don't have to instantiate them or anything like that. And these are the types of auto, Boolean, color, currency, double integer, and all the related integer ones, and then text. We're not going to be talking about text in today's webinar. I've got a separate webinar set up for that because that is a much bigger topic and really deserved its own webinar to cover all its intricacies. So we're going to pretty much cover all these other ones. And we're also going to talk about a couple class types as well. We're going to look at date and its related ones and the locale class type. Now, when I say class type, that means any type, because anything you create in Xojo, if you create a class, well, that all of a sudden is a type. But there are common ones that are built in that I'll refer to as class types, and those are some of the ones we're going to cover. So the syntax for defining your type for something is just the name, keyword as, and then the type name. If you're declaring variables, you'd use the dim or the static command to declare the variable in your code. If you're just declaring properties, you just put, name as type. And you can actually type that on the name field in the inspector, and it'll break the type out into the type field separately for you. Or you can type them in separately as you want. And the same thing with parameters to methods or events or whatnot. You use the name as type to specify the type of the item. You can get a list of all the intrinsic types that are built into Xojo by going here to developer.xojo.com/datatypes. And now we're going to go through a few of them. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through a bunch of slides on the various data types, hit some high points. And then after we go through all the slides, we're going to jump into Xojo, and we're going to look at some sample code that shows off some of the features we talked about in the slides. And certainly, if you have questions at any point, as always, feel free to bring them up. I can, looks like I can see my question window now, so I won't miss them for the time being. So the first type of types we're going to discuss are the whole number types. And these is integer. And that's probably the one you're really going to use the most often. This is a signed integer, so that means it can have positive values and it can have negative values, including 0. And it's important to understand that integer varies in how big of a value it can contain. It's essentially an alias, if you will, to one of the size-specific integer types, which we'll talk about in a moment, and that you're generally going to want to stay away from. But when your app is a 32-bit app, integer is a 32-bit integer, so that limits its maximum size. When your app is a 64-bit app, which right now, the only 64-bit apps you can create are iOS apps. Integer is a 64-bit number and can contain much larger values. So there's just something to keep in mind. And as we move to 64-bit throughout the coming year, integer automatically essentially becomes 64-bit enabled, and it allows you to store the much larger values in it. Now, companion to integer is uinteger, and the U stands for unsigned. This means that it can't contain any negative values. So it starts at 0 and it goes up. And that means it can contain a larger upper limit for a positive value, because essentially all the negatives are just used as more positive values to track. So integer and uinteger are probably the two that you're going to use, almost all the time. But there are other integer types. And these are the size-specific types. And they are int 8, int 16, int 32, and int 64. And the numbers indicate the behind-the-scenes size of the value. So int 8, for example, consists of 8 bits. And int 16, int 32, int 64, and whatnot. And that allows you to control the number of values. So for example, int 8 will have at most 256 possible values it can have. And because int 8 would be signed, that means it's going to go from minus 128 up through positive 127 typically. And there's also unsigned variants as well, with the U in front of them. Now, generally speaking, you're not going to use these size-specific types, and you don't want to use them. So when you're creating your apps, and you're like, oh well, I'm doing a for loop here, and it's it's never going to be higher than 100. So I'm just going to pick int 8 because I know that that'll work. Don't do that. Always just use integer. Really, the size-specific types are primarily, and really should only be used for interfacing with OS operating system libraries that require you to specify a value of a specific size. If you're not doing that, stick with integer and uinteger. You'll be a lot happier. Now, there is one exception to this rule, and that's when you really, really need super large values. In those particular cases, you may want to take advantage of int 64 and uint 64, particularly if you're on, say, a 32-bit system. So if your app is a 32-bit app and you're going to need really large values, maybe for database keys or something, you may want to specifically use int 64 or uint 64. But all the other ones, you're rarely going to have any reason to use them specifically. And that is important to understand when you look at the initial integer type. When I'm talking about whether it's 32-bit or 64-bit, essentially when you use the integer type in a 32-bit app, it is mapping to the int 32 type. And when you use integer on a 64-bit app, it is mapping to the int 64 type. So it's kind of doing that for you behind the scenes. You can read all about integer on the website here, the new doc site, the integer page. And a little bit more about this. There are methods that are now available on these types. So if you've done a lot of Xojo programming for years and years, you're aware there's a lot of global methods that work on these things. But the new framework adds some methods that are part of the integer type that allow you to do things. So in particular, there's now methods to convert to and from binary values. There's also a toText method, which allows you to convert the whole number, to text using a locale. And we'll talk about locale in a minute, but you can essentially think of that as the way the number is formatted. And you can specify an actual format string as well. There's also from text to go kind of the opposite direction. You have essentially some text that contains a number, and you want to convert it to an actual number type, so that it then is treated as a number and will work with, arithmetic and databases and that sort of thing. And this is a restrictive conversion from text. So if you attempt to convert from text, if you have text that doesn't actually contain a number and you try to convert it into a number, well, that's not going to work. You'll get an exception. If you do have situations where you want a little bit more flexibility, you can use the parse method. And this does a more flexible conversion from text. So if the text, essentially, if the text starts with a number And if it has some, stuff after it that's not a number, that's okay. That'll get ignored. But it'll at least be able to parse out the number part of the text and give you back a number that you can then put in the appropriate number typed variable. So these are some of the new things that are available on the whole number types, which are primarily integer. Now, the next ones to talk about are decimals. Now, double is one of the first ones that people think of when they want to store decimal values. And the thing to point out the web page here for the docs on it, but the thing to remember about double is it's actually a floating point data type. Now, explaining this is a bit technical. I probably can't even do it justice, but the doc page does have links to the Wikipedia page that explains this. But essentially, this is a standard, a computing standard for tracking floating point numbers. And because they're floating point, it means there's certain values that you can't actually store in a double. The decimal values just can't be represented in the structure that's used for this type of floating point thing. And there's also rounding considerations to deal with doubles. So the long and short of it is that, generally speaking, you don't want to use a double for anything that is involving money, because you could end up with things getting rounded strangely, and you could end up with values that aren't being represented the way you expect. So doubles are not a great choice for money, but they are commonly used for lots of other things and are, like I said, a standard floating point data type. So it's, something you can pass into operating system APIs that require it, that sort of thing. There's also a type called single that has less precision as double. And essentially, these are short terms for double would be double precision floating point, and single is single precision floating point. There's almost no reason to ever use single. Obviously, it has less precision, which means it uses a little bit less memory for storage. I don't remember the actual bytes that are being used between the two, but that's largely irrelevant in this day and age. So there's not, again, any real good reasons to be using single over double. Unless, again, you have some OS API you need to configure, some DLL or something that actually requires something to be a single for some particular reason, then you can use that. But for your general apps, double is what you're going to want to use for this sort of thing. And the last decimal data type is currency, which you can find there on the doc site. And this is a fixed point number. This has 15 digits to the left of the decimal point and then 4 to the right. So it can't store values that are as large as a double, for example. But because it's fixed point, it doesn't run into rounding issues, and it can store all the particular values in its limited range. So by its name, this is the sort of thing you would want to use for something that is, money related. And from what I understand, the behind the scenes, this is some sort of large data type that I think is using a 64-bit integer maybe to handle all the implementation details. But that, by and large, isn't going to matter. The important thing is that it's fixed point and is more appropriate for usage with money type situations. All right, just as with the integer stuff, there are some methods and conversion stuff you can do with decimals. And when you're dealing with double, the first thing is to consider the equals method. And this allows you to compare doubles using a tolerance. And again, this goes back to, because of the way doubles are stored with floating point, using just the equal sign to compare doubles. Sometimes you may have two double values that look like they actually have the same value, but they don't. And there might be a bunch of decimal points and a bunch of zeros and then a 1, so .00001 off there because of rounding. And you can use the equals method to allow you to compare two numbers, so you can say, yeah, those are actually, I'm going to consider those two equal. So that can come in handy. There's also the toText method, which much like the one on integer, converts the value to text so that you can, display it on windows, views, that sort of thing. There's the from text method that will do, much like the other one, restrictive conversion from a text value to a double. And there's the parse method, which does a more flexible conversion from text. So same as before. And those are the two methods. And depending on, what you're dealing with, you one or the other might be the appropriate thing. So if you've got data input from a user in a field on one of your screens or something like that, you could use from text to convert that back to a double. But if the user, happens to type in that field just some text and it's not a double at all, if you use from text, an exception is raised. And that could be entirely what you want, but it's important that you actually catch the exception and then deal with it in your own way. Either tell the user the data is invalid, or say, well, I don't really care if they input invalid data. I'm just going to, go with a default value of some kind. But that's up to you. And the parse method will try to do a little bit of that for you rather than raising the exception. It'll attempt to get a value out. And if it can't, I think it just returns you a 0, which might be what you want, but might not be what you want because, what if the user actually typed a 0 versus typing bad data? How could you tell the difference? So keep in mind that how those two work and choose the one that's appropriate for your situation. Now, I want to talk a little bit about general number conversion. And you can convert between number types using simple assignment, but this may result in a loss of the precision of the data or loss of some of the data itself. So just a simple example here, you can see if I create a double and I set it to some value, and then I create an integer, I can just assign the double to the integer. And the integer will now contain just the integer part of that, so it'll be 45. So I've lost data there. I've lost the decimal portion of that double. But I can also assign the integer back to the double, and now the double will just contain 45.0. So essentially that 0.63 got lost in the conversion, which is about what you would expect. But it's important to just think about these sort of things. Stuff isn't going to get remembered once you move it around like this. And if this is sort of thing that concerns you greatly, there are compiler warnings you can flip on in Xojo. And then when you do a project analyze, it can come back and tell you situations where these sort of things are being done so that you can kind of eyeball them and see if that's what you expected to happen or not. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about locale. Now, this is not an intrinsic data type. This is a class. And it's a class for, as we have here with lots of words, linguistic, cultural, and other locale-specific information. So for example of that would be English is spoken in the United States using the metric system, which, of course, no one here in the United States uses the metric system, unfortunately. This class is located in the Xojo.core namespace. And you can find its information here. And this is an example of how it can be used. And you can see, it's a class. You have to use its path to its class name. So here you can see I'm declaring the variable, and I'm using xojo.core.locale because that is its full name. On iOS, of course, you could just use locale because the Xojo.core, all the Xojo namespace stuff is implied. And if you're using a different project type, you can skip the Xojo.core by just putting using Xojo.core at the top of your method if you want, or setting it for the module or class or whatnot. And then you could just type locale. And we'll see some of that when we look at Xojo code in a little bit. But I put the full thing here so you can know exactly where it is. And locale has a shared method on it called current that'll just give you back whatever the current locale is. And that's commonly what you might want to be using. So here you can say I just set the current locale to xojo.core.locale.current. And I now have the current locale in that particular variable. But I don't need to necessarily assign it because it is a shared method. I could just always type locale.current if I wanted to. And if I want a specific locale, you can just ask for it. So you can create a new instance of locale and then pass in the locale identifier. So here I've asked for English from the US. And there are a lot of these little string codes for picking out particular locale stuff. And I think there's a link in that doc page that sends you off to an external site that has all that stuff documented. Right. Edwin is asking here, he tried using in the project browser before, but never got it to work. Yeah, we'll take a look at that when we switch over to Xojo. It's probably a little different and not obvious to people how you would set that up. All right, now we can talk a little bit about dates. Dates are also a class, or date is a class, but we're going to talk about several of the classes that are related to working with dates. And these are classes for date time storage and related calculations. And they're also in Xojo.core. And the date class, you can see the page for its docs are right here, is right there. And a date actually contains both a date and a time. So maybe it should be called date time, I don't know, but it's called date. And it do want to remember though, it does also contain a time component, which you can choose to ignore if you only care about the date. An important difference, now I'm talking about the new date class here that's in the Xojo framework. There is a date class in the older classic framework. Dates in the new Xojo framework cannot be modified. They're what we call immutable. So you can't like create a date and then change the day property to, make it a different date. You can't do that. Once you create a date, it's that date and it's always that date. Date has some methods on it to convert it to text, to convert general text into an actual date object. It has a now shared method that gives you back the current date and time. In the classic framework, you would do that by just creating a new instance of date. You would do, dim d as new date, and that would give you a new date that would always, by default, be set to the current date and time. You don't do that anymore with the date class that's in the Xojo framework. Instead, you just use the now shared method. Now, related to date is the DateInterval class. And this allows you to perform date math, essentially. So it allows you to get a date that is, you start with a date. So you start with a date that's today, and you want to know what the date is 1 week from now. You can use the DateInterval class to say, add 7 days to the date, and that'll give you back a new date that is a week later, that sort of thing. So it's essentially the way to work with the fact that you can't modify a date. You instead create a date interval and you apply it to the date, and that gives you back a new date with the interval applied. And the intervals can go forward, they can go backward, that sort of thing. Also used with date is the TimeZone class that allows you to track time zones. And that pretty much does what you might expect. It allows you to track the time zone you're in, so that you can, adjust times accordingly. Here I'm in the Eastern time zone, and so it is, early afternoon, 1:30 p.m.-ish. And, all of you are certainly not in my time zone, all have different times, and time zone class helps you to translate and deal with that sort of stuff. All right, auto is a new data type that was added back in the last release of 2014. You can see its page right here. And an auto type essentially says you've just created a variable that can contain a value of any type. Now, at the beginning, you'll remember I said that everything in Xojo has to be typed, and that is strictly true. But if you use an auto type, it allows you to kind of not necessarily care what the type of the variable is, because you can just stick anything in the variable. Now, if you've used the classic framework a bit, you might remember there is a data type there called variant that essentially is going to be long-term replaced with auto, but variant obviously still continues to work. And a big difference between auto and variant is that auto does not convert a value to another type, where variant would do that. And was kind of problematic because it didn't always convert to the other type very well. And you could end up with some really obscure bugs in code if you tried to use variant, and probably in ways that it wasn't well suited for. So auto allows you to create a variable that you can stick any other type into it. And this, because it's any type, it can be an intrinsic type, it can be a class type, it can be whatever. You use introspection to get the type if you are unsure of what type you just that the auto variable contains. You can use introspection to look it up. And whoops, I switched a little too soon, going from the more powerful auto to the simpler Boolean. Let's go back here. And the other thing to remember is because it does not convert to the other type, you have to use it as the appropriate type. So if you put an integer into an auto variable, it's treated as an integer at that point. So if you want to convert it to a string, you actually have to get it into an integer and then use the appropriate methods to convert the integer from the string. All right, Boolean, going from auto, which is a more complicated type, to Boolean, which is easily the simplest type. And I'm not going to talk too much about Boolean. It's got a page. It can be true or it can be false. Important thing for people to remember, not everyone probably knows this completely off the top of their head, but if you declare a Boolean variable and don't assign it a value, it's false by default. And as you can see, Boolean is very, very simple, but very useful, used all over the place. All right, the last type I want to cover here today before we look at some code is the color type. And there's its page. And it stores, as you might expect, color values. It does have a bunch of constants on there for specific color values. So if you, I don't remember what some of the constants are, but I think there is red on there. So you could just do color.red and you have a red color right there. You don't need to call any of the methods to create it or use any of the syntax. There are some methods on there for creating color values using HSV and HSVA. I don't really use those much. I forgot what the acronym is. I should have looked that up. But the one I tend to use, hue, HSV is hue something value maybe. It's more of a color pro type mechanism of specifying colors. And me being colorblind, here we go. Edwin is telling me it stands for hue saturation value alpha. Thank you, Edwin. S is for saturation. RGB is the one most of you are more familiar with, or at least I am, is red, green, blue. And you specify the proportions of each. And then the A's on each of those indicate you can specify an alpha component to indicate whether the item is opaque or all the way to be completely transparent. All right, let's switch over to Xojo. All right, a very simple project here. And actually, to look at some of this stuff, we'll probably just step through the debugger and see some results and things. So let's just run this. I think I set these up with breaks, so they should jump right into the debugger when I hit the button. All right, so you can see here, they're starting at the top. There's some simple declarations of integers. Nothing too fancy there, just so you can see what they look like. You can see here, actually, I stepped through the code. Let me just move a couple things out of the way so I can see. You can see in the debugger the values. So I scroll around. And you can see here, how these things get converted. So binary is going to be converted to the binary value for 15. And you can see what that looks like there. Same with the hex value and the octal value. And those things are strings, of course. I mean, the number doesn't actually change. So it's not like, you need to do math and say, oh, well, I need to do my math on the hex numbers. A number is a number. This is just representations of it. So F in hex is the same as 15 in decimal. As you can see, if I go back converting these particular things into actual values, they all come back as 15. All right, we now have a simple value here. We want to convert it to text. And so you can see here, this is just going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because I didn't specify any formatting or anything like that. If I tell it to use a particular locale and then specify a format string, the text now has a comma in it. I can go the reverse way. If I've got some text that's in a string, I can convert it back to a value. And you'll notice we just skipped over this block of code here. It turns out in my testing, I found a bug on the OS 10 side that is not converting this stuff the way it should be. So that's not working on OS 10, but it is working on the other target platforms. And so that should be fixed soon, but for now I blocked out this block of code because it just raises an exception. And then this is an example here of the parse command. So you can see I've got some text in here that has, a number and then some non-numeric stuff after it. And I can still convert that back to a value because the parse command will stop attempting to parse the number when it reaches a non-numeric value. So in this particular case, value is just going to be 1, 2, 3. And this may be the command you want to use for your input. Again, choose the one that works for how you want your app to work. All right, so that's the whole numbers. Let's see a question here from Edwin. How does a text data type deal with encodings again? Yes, that's a great topic. Such a big topic that is the one that I have scheduled its entire webinar for, and I won't be talking about today. But I think that webinar is beginning in July. And we'll be covering text and encodings and all kinds of fun stuff related to that. All right, let's move on to the decimal number examples. So here you can see that I put at the very top of the code, I have a using command here. This will, because I put it in the method, it's only going to apply to this method. But because I put using Xojo.core, that now means that any of the classes that are in the Xojo.core namespace are now directly accessible to me just by their class name. I don't need to put the full Xojo.core.class name in here. And you'll eventually see down here I'm using, actually, I use the full name here. And you can see if I choose not to, I can just put locale and leave that off because I have the using. And that is one nice thing is even if you do put the using in here, the long name still works, of course. So it does make it, if you're copying and pasting code, you're not going to necessarily break anything if you add a using. All right, so you can see here, going through the debugger. The first test here, we're going to attempt to see if these two values are the same. And they're not the same. This one has something way off here that says, oh, they're different. And, right now I've set them specifically, which is great. But sometimes if you're just doing math on some numbers, it's possible that due to rounding after doing a series of mathematical expressions, you could end up with results that you kind of think should be the same, but aren't because of some rounding that ends up with results that look like this. So in this particular case, you can use the equals command. And that will allow you to compare them, and it can come back and say, oh, that's close enough. These are close enough to be considered equal. So you may not need to use that thing a lot, but I just pointed out that it is there for people that sometimes forget that's available. As we continue to chug through the code, we can convert some values here. So here I'm going to, oh, I got a mistake. This says integer. I'm not going to do a good example of converting that to a double if it's an integer. Oh, Juiced is noting my audio has gotten poor. I don't know why that would be. Hopefully it straightens out good. Oh, now Edwin says my audio sounds like Knight Rider Kit. I'm going to pause while I check the Zoom settings. All right, Gavin is noting audio sounds okay now. How about anyone else? Are people still hearing me okay? Audio is fine now. Okay, great. Hopefully that was a momentary internet glitch. That never happens. Strange. All right. Well, as I was saying before my audio cut out, I noticed here that I declared this tax as an integer, and it's supposed to be a double. So let's fix that. So we can go through the code a bit better. All right. So we're back up here. So we're on the tax line. So tax is set to 8.5. So now I can convert it to a text value. And you can see here that by default, it's converting it like this. There's quite a few zeros that are tacked on to the end. And Edwin is reminding me to stop downloading movies while I'm doing webinars because that kills your bandwidth. That is a good tip. I'll have to tweet that later. So that converted this here with lots of zeros at the end. But if I want something more specific, I can specify a locale. I can put in a format string to get something that is a little tighter, maybe more what I'm expecting. Can also use different types of format strings. And the format strings are largely compatible with what you're used to already if you've used the format command in the classic framework. Again, on the page for double.toText, there are links to external sites that lists all the format commands that we support or that is supported by these types. So you can see the various options for how you can lay out stuff. All right, this next one shows you how you could take a text value that contains something that essentially is a double and convert it to an actual double. And as you can see here, it rounding again, darn double rounding. There's some gobbledygook here at the end. So that's the sort of thing that you may want to be checking for. You may want to be truncating for. Maybe you want to be using currency instead of double, depending on how this value is going to be used, that sort of thing. And then the same sort of thing with the parse. It will attempt to process just the stuff that's numeric and then stop when it finds non-numeric and not raise an exception or anything like that. So here it's able to get out 1, 2, 3. All right, I'm just clearing a bunch of these everyone can hear me comments so I can see if there's any questions that come through. All right, let's continue that. All right, now let's move on to date. And the first thing you can see here is the use of the date.now shared method. And you can see I just assigned that to a variable called now. That was largely and is largely unnecessary because it's, I suppose it's slightly less typing because now I could just refer to now. But this also means that now won't update. It got the now value from this point in time. And if I go to use this a long time later, maybe it's not as accurate as you want. So always just using date.now in your code is probably the way to go. You can create new dates using specific values. So you can specify the year, the month, the day, and you can also specify time information. It is required that you put in the time zone, however. So this here is going to be August 1st, 2015, and it'll be in my time zone for the time portion. Now you can do a little bit of date math on this. So we now have a date here that is set to August 1st, 2015. And we can add 2 months to it. So I can create a new date interval, and I can say, all right, well, I want to add 2 months. So I set the months to 2. And I can get a new date, and I can just add the date interval to the current date. Could have put D here, but I use date.now. And then if we look at future, where is future? It is 2015. And oh, yeah, I didn't use the August date. So now 2 months from now is August 9th. That makes sense. Output, you have lots of flexibility over the output of dates. And there's format styles. There's short, medium, long, and short, medium, long, full, and none that you can use for both the date format and the time format. So I'm going to step through these, and we can see, put the date output right here as it changes using each of the different ones. So you can see this is the short format for the date. I didn't specify a time, so it's just using this particular format for the time. You can see medium date is a little bit longer, time staying the same. See this next one, I said don't show the time, use no format for time, so I'm only getting the long date. The full date has everything written out here. And this one has no date, so it's only showing the time. And this last one will show a medium date and a medium time. So you can see the time. Apparently medium time is the default, but there are same short, medium, long, and full, and none for the time. So you get a lot of combinations you can work with there for how you want to display this stuff. That makes sense. And right now I use the current locale, which is obviously United States format, which uses the backward one of month, day, year. But you know, you pick whatever is for your specific locale. You can leave it at locale current so that your app will show whatever the user expects. You have control over all of that. All right, Lance is asking about SQL date. I don't think there is SQL date on the new date class. We'll have to go double check the doc on that, but I don't think there is that. And Gavin is confirming that. He says it's not there yet. There is a feedback case to get it added. All right, moving on through some more date math. You can do the same sort of thing by subtracting. So I could subtract the current date using and subtract our 2-month date interval. And that will give us the past, which is 2 months ago. So that was sometime in April. And you can also do math to take, essentially to subtract 2 dates from each other and then get the interval in between, so how much time elapsed. So you could take, you know, this here is a date in 2030 and subtracting from now, and you can see the interval here would tell you, you know, how many years that is. So it's 14 years, 6 months, 22 days, blah, 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 until that event occurs. You can also convert something to GMT, and that can be handy, particularly if you're saving things in databases. It's often good to not have stuff be locale specific and instead translate that when you're displaying. So you can convert a date by using the seconds from 1970 property and using that in the constructor and then specifying a specific time zone. And then the last little snippet here takes some text that contains a date and converts it to an actual date. So we can see here, looking at my date, that it now has the year 2015, the month, the day, the time, all in there. So that's some of the stuff you can use with date. Quite a bit there to play around with. All right. Comment here. Edwin is noting you can add SQL datetime as an extension to the date class. Yeah, absolutely. You could use one of the format strings to probably spit that out the way you want in the meantime. All right, this is auto. So the first thing you see here is I declared a variable. I called it auto. I can assign anything I want to it. So here I'm assigning essentially an integer. Now, because it contains an integer, it's treated as an integer, so I can just use it in an integer expression like this. And I get the result I want. Here, I can assign it back to an integer, and it's now in an actual integer variable. And then once it's in an integer variable, I can call the integer methods on it, so I can convert it back to text. I can create a double here. And I'm just reading through, what do I have here? All right, I don't think that specifically did what I wanted, because that didn't say, this should have said auto here, not double. But anyway, otherwise that code would work the same. So essentially here is saying convert the type of the auto back to a double, its original type, and then call the toText method on it. And then you can use introspection to check the type of an auto variable. So here I create a variable as auto, I assign the value to it, and then we'll use introspection to get its type, and then we can check the type value here, and you can see it says that it's an int 32. And here it's not going to say just integer or uinteger or anything like that. It's actually going to say the specific type. So right now I'm running on 32-bit. So this is a 32-bit integer. So it's coming back with that specific type. And this is the sort of thing where you can start to use if you're actually going to take advantage of auto to store things of different types, and then have a more generic method that says, okay, what's in my auto variable, checks the type, and then converts it to an appropriate variable of the right type, and then does its own thing. So that's how you can start to use some of that. All right, for Boolean and color, I don't think we're going to step through much code. We'll just take a quick peek at these two very simple ones. Yeah, Boolean. Nothing much here to say about Boolean. I do want to point out to people that may not know this, but you don't need to include the if something equals true in an if then. You just can put the value. So this essentially means if B is true, then. And if it means if the expression is true, then do this. And B being a Boolean expression that has its value sets true, that looks fine. But you do see sometimes people write, well, if B equals true. And that's a little redundant. You can write that if that's clearer to you, but it's not necessary. And then color. Again, very simple here. You can use the color constants to just get particular things. So here, color.red is going to give me back red as a color. And again, you don't necessarily need to assign these things to variables. If you're just using them, you can just refer to the constant. So you could just put color.red somewhere. And you can, of course, create these things using values. I only put RGB here because that's the one I actually know off the top of my head. I don't know hue saturation values off the top of my head. But you can see here, this creates red and it calls RGB, all the red, no green or blues. And then this creates same thing, red, but it makes it partially transparent. So that's a high level of data types that are in Xojo, but with particular focus or complete focus on the new types that are now available in the Xojo framework and are all available as of 2014, release 3. These things are all available in all project types. You can use them right across all your project types. You probably do want to use them. I think they're a little slicker, a little easier, except for the case where a few things might still be missing, but we're continuing to add stuff. Upcoming related webinar to this will be the text webinar, which will cover the text data type and encodings. And the next webinar is going to cover storage, so it'll cover dictionary and arrays and that sort of thing. I've been getting a lot of requests for that. All right, questions. Let's see here. I've got a question from Edwin asking about memory block differences between the new framework and the old framework. And he's noting that the old framework, the classic framework, memory blocks were somewhat analogous to strings in a way. And in the new framework, they are not at all. Memory blocks are blocks of memory, and text, not string, text is text. And he's asking why we chose to do the difference. I will be covering that greatly in the text webinar, but essentially they're separated because they're separate things. Treating string as binary data is incredibly problematic and not really a good idea in this day and age. So they were separated for that at a high level reason, but I'll have more specifics about that in the text webinar. All right, I'm just scanning the questions here. There's a few I might need to clear. Oh, and the earlier one that I missed. Oh, two I missed here from Edwin. Let's go back to Xojo. Usage of using, you'll notice what, like on the date code, I put a using right up here. What I could have done is on the main class, in this case, the window, I could have just added a using clause right here. And then over here in the inspector, which I am having trouble reaching because of other stuff on my screen, I could just type xojo.core in here. And that essentially will apply the using xojo.core to the entire class, or window in this case, or module if you have that, so that you would not have to add it to the beginning of each method. It's up to you which ones you want to use. I tend to continue to be sticking it at the top of the method, probably mostly just because I'm familiar with that, having worked with .NET for many, many years. But adding it to the class is also a perfectly viable technique. John is asking how to switch between the new Xojo framework and the classic framework, or can you just mix them? And yeah, you can mix them on all the project types except for iOS. iOS only has the Xojo framework available. It does not have the classic framework. But all the other project types have both. So you can mix them willy-nilly, much as you want. You could create, in a single method, you can create a variable that is the old date class from the classic framework, and you can create a variable that is the new date class from the new Xojo framework. The only thing to keep in mind when you do that is if you do need to mix and match, you may want to just stick with the long names when you're referring to Xojo framework stuff to make it very clear which is which. You don't have to do that. You could have using commands. If I switch, so right here I have using xojo.core. So you can see right here I have dim now as date. Well, this is going to grab the new date. But what if I want to create an old date? If only I could type. You can use the global keyword to grab stuff that's in the global namespace that much of the classic framework stuff is. So this would give me an old classic framework date. So it allows you to still access stuff that may be obscured because it has the same name because you used a using clause. I don't know if this is easier than just instead sticking with the long namespaces. So if you're going to mix your code, maybe just use xojo.core.date and then date for the classic framework stuff. You'll have to come up with a technique that works for you. But yeah, you can absolutely mix and match in desktop, web, and console projects. Edwin is asking if the classic framework will become obsolete in the future. Well, you know, can't really predict the future. We have no plans at this point to obsolete the classic framework. There's a lot of stuff in there. Certainly the new framework does not match the classic framework on a feature by feature level. So at the very least, until we reach that point, we wouldn't even consider, you know, doing anything with the classic framework to make it obsolete or deprecation or anything like that. So I think you got quite a long time before the classic framework is going to go away. The big reason to use the new stuff is obviously it's newer, has some more modern design behind it, and is fully cross-compatible between iOS and the other project types, whereas the classic framework completely not available on iOS projects. Let's see here. Mark is asking, if you built a project before the new framework, what happens when you simply load it and compile with a release that has the new framework? It will just run. The new framework stuff is essentially a superset of, well, I wouldn't even say a superset. It's kind of a separate thing. So if you're not using it, you're not using it. So you're not going to start using it automatically. You have to actually, you know, change your code to use it. So if you have projects you've written before the new framework existed and you load them into a current version of Xojo that has the new framework, well, that project's still going to use the classic framework and work the same as it always has. All right, let's see here. Juiced is asking which framework will be used for Raspberry Pi. My understanding is that both will be available for Raspberry Pi. But I don't know that for 100%. So we'll see when that reaches beta, I guess. And Mark is following up. So for now, to use the new framework, you must have a using. No, you don't have to have a using. You can, you know, you can certainly see if I have on the whole number one. Did I put using at the top? Yeah, I didn't put using at the top. So I mean, you could certainly just put the full name in without using if you want to use new framework stuff. So that's mostly what I was suggesting. If you need to mix and match code, you may want to just stick with the full namespace name so the new stuff kind of stands out more from the old stuff. That sort of thing. John is asking, how would I suggest you maintain or extend existing code? Well, if you have existing code, there's probably not a lot of reason to migrate it to the new framework today, unless you have some need to share your code with an iOS project. Or if you want to take advantage of something new in the new framework that wasn't available in the classic framework. Trying to think of something like that offhand. But it's possible, you know, maybe you really, the date interval stuff would be very handy for you to figure out, you know, ranges between two different dates. And maybe that would be better for you than the way it worked in the classic framework. Well, that might give you a reason to say, you know what, I need to start using the new date class in place of the old one. So like I said, you can do that on a case-by-case basis. You don't even have to do it for an entire project. You can just have a single method that maybe you're updating to use new framework code, but the rest of your project is continuing to use the classic framework. You know, it's going to be completely on a case-by-case basis and a project-by-project basis. I mean, if you've got the world's largest project that, you know, has had 50 people, different people work on it, and you feel it's rather fragile, that maybe is not the best case to go in and start, you know, gutting things and changing stuff around. But if you're starting a new project, maybe it makes sense to start with the new Xojo framework and take advantage of its features. Something I'll be covering in a webinar later this summer is the new framework's HTTP socket. That has been a big thing that people want to take advantage of because it uses HTTP 1.1. So that can be a real good reason to update any existing code that's using the old HTTP socket. Gavin is noting the date stuff is quite an improvement. Another thing that's a significant improvement is the JSON stuff that's in the new framework. It's much, much faster than the JSON classes that were in the classic framework. So if you have code that's using JSON, you might want to consider using the new framework stuff and updating that portion of your app. So like I said, there's no hard and fast, easy answer. Juice is bringing up dictionary. Dictionary does also have some other cool features, and we'll be talking about dictionary next week's webinar. No hard and fast, easy, one size fits all answer. Just, read what's in there, try to get an understanding of it, listen to these webinars, and hopefully you'll be able to decide which makes sense for you. And by all means, ask. If you don't know, ask. Go to the forum, ask a question, say, hey, my project works this way. I'm wondering, does it make sense if I, make this switch from this to that? People will have done it or have tried it. You'll get the benefit of everyone else's experience, and you can bounce ideas around. Definitely highly recommended. And as people who are heavy participants in our forum, you pretty much know, you're not going to get yelled at like some other developer forums. People, are polite there. So let's see here. Edwin is asking if the new JSON is more stable. He's noted some exceptions when assigning certain values. Well, JSON is JSON. He's assigning certain values such as color. You can't put color in JSON, so that might be a reason for exception. JSON can only handle a few certain types of data, integer, decimals, text, maybe something else. So you can't stick class types or anything like that in there. You'll get some sort of invalid JSON item exception. I think the big thing with the new JSON classes is just that they are tremendously faster. I think there's been some forum posts that people have done benchmarks, and it almost seems like it's an order of magnitude of parsing speed with large JSON files. And that can matter for a lot of people that use JSON for, internet communications and other things. So being able to get that data parsed out quickly so you can use it, incredibly handy. And like I said, I do have the HTTP socket webinar coming up. I don't have the full schedule memorized just yet, but stay tuned. And if you do look at the upcoming webinar things and you're like, oh, Paul's got these in here, but there's some other things I want to talk about, hey, shoot me an email. I'll see if I can get something in the schedule. And the last thing Edwin's asking here is to convert color. Yeah, if you're putting color in JSON, you got to convert it to something else, a hex value or RGB values or something, but you can't just stick the color in there as is. That won't work. All right, well, I want to thank everyone. Looks like we're about out of time for this webinar. If you came in late, missed anything, want to watch it again, this will be online the next day or two, the recorded version. And the little sample project here that we've been looking at, I'll also make sure that's available to download in case you want to, run through that, play around with it, change things. All right, so thanks everyone. Have a great day.